Thanks so much for joining us today on Feelin' Good, sponsored by Warren County Community Services. I'm your host, Shelly Abrams, and do I have a treat for you today? Sometimes we're in the Channel 6 studio, sometimes we're on a field trip. And today we are on a fabulous field trip that I wanted all of you to hear about. Today my guest is Jack Dominic, who's the director of the Voice of America Museum on Tylersville Road here in Westchester, Ohio. And I want to welcome Jack this morning and we actually are filming in the morning because we have so much to talk about. We may just talk on and on for a couple hours. So sit back, relax, and listen up. So Jack, thank you for having us this morning here at the VOA Museum.
Welcome. We're delighted to have you and your audience share a little bit about this iconic facility that really people around here know very little about, but its impact on the geopolitical world is just awesome. And we love to tell people when they come here to the museum that they're going to experience a nexus of really high technology for the time and very, very innovative programming.
Well, speaking of for the time, the mission of the VOA is a very timely topic even today as we're talking about getting the truth out in terms of the facts. Tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. The genesis of the Voice of America goes back to the early 1940s when the United States, obviously, and the rest of the world were involved in the Second World War. Now, many people from their history lessons would remember that the Nazis, Hitler and his people, they weren't very good people, but one thing they understood, perhaps more than most at that time, was the impact that media could play on public perceptions and public ideas and acceptance of their Nazi rule. And so Hitler was a master at that. At that time, for instance, he had over 60 radio stations in Germany that broadcast all Hitler all the time. So Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, was looking at this and he says, you know, we don't do a very good job of sharing the United States' perspective with the rest of the world. So that is the genesis of Voice of America. He called together some broadcast folks from CBS and NBC and all the networks of the time, mutual networks, to Washington. And he said, who can build high-power transmitters that can send our message at that time to Europe? And there was a great silence in the room except for one person who happened to work for the Crosley Corporation. And he raised his hand and said, we're already doing that. And of course, everybody was kind of aghast. What many people don't understand is back in the late 30s and early 40s, we all know about WLW. You know, one time it was 500,000 watts and you could listen to it all for the commercial broadcast. Crosley also, across the street at the same time, had WLWO, which was his shortwave service to Europe. He was already broadcasting to Europe in French, Italian, and German. So it was a natural when the government said, who can build these transmitters? No one else had built them. So that, by the way, is why Bethany Station, this facility, was constructed in Cincinnati. It's not because it's on a hill. It's not because there's some, radio frequency stuff in the ground or something. It's here because of Powell Crosley Jr. And he had the engineers that knew how to build it. And that's how the Voice of America ended up in Cincinnati. And then the really interesting thing, and kind of, I'm talking a little too long here, but
No,
the really interesting thing is that Roosevelt really was looking at the Voice of America to be a propaganda arm. And I'm using propaganda in the, I would say, the negative sense. In other words, you only tell the people the good things, but you don't tell them the bad things. He was talked out of that, mainly because he hired to run the early Voice of America people like John Houseman,
oh really?
Edward R. Murrow.
Oh,
And they went to the president and they said, President Roosevelt, we think it's a wonderful idea that you build these stations and you have programming, but we suggest it's not propaganda. We need to tell the truth. When we're right, we're right. When we're wrong, and we need to admit it. That's the only way, eventually, you are going to get belief on your audience. People are not dumb. They will wise up. And that's been the mantra of the Voice of America since the beginning. Tell the truth and let the world decide.
I'm just speechless thinking about that. And that doesn't happen too often, that I'm speechless. But thinking about that, it's such a compelling message then and now.
For
Because,
sure.
I mean, just today, that was the topic on the morning news, once again, is, trying to differentiate between fact and fiction. So,
That's correct.
with that being said, you mentioned the Crosley influence.
Crosley's influence was definitely one of technology. You have to remember that the programming that was produced for the Voice of America, none of it was produced in this building. The studios were always in Washington, D.C., where they are now. And by the way, you can go visit. They have tours.
Right.
Or early on in New York City. So the technical plant was here. And that's, a lot of people, when they come, they say, well, where are the studios? Well, there were never any studios here.
Interesting. So we've just, this is kind of an ad hoc studio that we've made up, this setting this morning. And we're actually sitting in
This is
the
a control room. This control room was the operations center. Now, the control room we're sitting in right now was actually put in 1965. Okay. So this is relatively new. Mm-hmm. We do have some photographs of the earlier control room. This control room looks a little bit like a NASA control room, and the reason it was built is remember, there were 6 250,000-watt transmitters running within 30 feet of where you're sitting. Now guess what? They give off lots of heat. And before this room was built and air conditioning was put in, the control room was very often more than 100 degrees. So what a very comfortable place to live.
Right.
But from this control room, the 6 transmitters were controlled, and many people, especially in the Lebanon area, will remember driving up 75 when all the property were the antennae. And the property went all the way from the expressway, which is now the hospital and the Home Depot and whatever else we have over there, all the way to Butler Warren Road, Liberty Way, and of course Tylersville. If you measure that off, it's 1 square mile. Okay. And on that 1 square mile, there were more than 20 different antenna arrays. Each antenna array was constructed so that it would beam a signal to a different part of the world. So for instance, transmitter 1, let's say there's a program in French coming in and it needs to go to Algeria. So it would go on one of the transmitters, the proper frequency would be punched up, and that transmitter would be connected to the antenna pointed to Algeria. Now at the same time, there might be a Spanish program going to Argentina, or a German program during the Second World War going to Berlin. So this all went on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week during the Second World War.
you mentioned just a couple different countries, and I know I've toured here before because our ILR class, Miami University's ILR class, right, first, I think, invited you to the VOA Miami University Learning Center to give a presentation. Right. And then I followed up with you, and we created a tour. Mm-hmm. So I think that was my first time touring. Right. And I have brought people, I've been here 2 or 3 different times following that tour, because you just drive by it so often. And you see the driveway, that long driveway that leads back to this building. That
looks like a prison.
Well, and it's the original building.
It is the original building. Okay. And it is not, when I give a speech or talk, or people come and we're talking to them, it is not uncommon for people to have either a fuzzy or no idea what the Voice of America is. Mm-hmm. That shouldn't be surprising. The Voice of America programming was never meant to be broadcast in the United States. It was the United States' message going to the rest of the world. And that's been a flexible thing. When this building this building operated from 1944 until the late 1990s. During that time, as many as 50 different languages were beamed to different countries, etc. Now, those languages change. For instance, today, by the way, Voice of America still operates. Yes. It just doesn't use shortwave, so that's why this place was decommissioned. They use cellular, satellite, and other modern technologies, of course, the internet. But the languages change. For instance, there is no longer a German service of the Voice of America. Oh. No reason for it.
Okay.
There's a French, but it's not aimed at France. There are many third world countries that still speak French. So now you can imagine there are many of the Arabic languages that are currently being used. And the one place, actually 2 places, but the one major place that shortwave is still used, I bet you can guess, and that is to get into North Korea. Oh. Because the people in North Korea really don't have access to a lot of the new technologies. So shortwave is one of the ways you can still get into a closed country like that.
Well, speaking of that, I mean, I'm really just thinking of so many things I want to mention. Tell our viewers the story about visitors that visit here and are very emotional about visiting.
It's very moving. Very often, I'd say weekly, we'll have somebody come and they'll come up the driveway, and either from their accent or you can tell that, you know, they weren't born in Cincinnati, okay? Mm-hmm. And they're visiting Cincinnati, and somehow they learn, wait a minute, that's where Voice of America is? They come here almost as if they were going to the Vatican or Mecca. And many of them have tears in their eyes, and they'll say, I listened to the Voice of America when I lived in Czechoslovakia, or I listened such and such. Many times they listened at great peril. We have a display here. I love to show people, because right next to our Volksempfänger radio, which was the Hitler radio that he subsidized for his people, for his 68 stations, right across the exhibit hall is another radio. And it's kind of interesting. It was donated, 5 years ago. Somebody knocked on the door during the daytime. Now, I always go down and say, I'm sorry, we're not open right now. We'll be open and such and such. He says, no, I want to give you something. And he presents me with this transistor radio that looks like something you would have in your garage to listen to the Cincinnati Reds.
Right,
okay?
Right.
And he could tell I wasn't real impressed. We don't need another radio here. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But then he said, let me tell you the story. I emigrated from Ukraine, and I lived in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I bought this radio, Soviet manufactured, about 1960. And he said it was designed so it couldn't receive the frequencies that the Voice of America broadcast on. And then his wife looked at me, and she looked up and she said, "We knew a guy."
We knew a guy.
And what she meant was that there was a gentleman in the village that was very adroit at electronics, and he rewired, put some coils in it so that it could. And Lola, that's his wife, says, everybody in the village had one, but nobody would admit it. And we called it our under-the-blanket radio. What people would do to listen is amazing. Now, the story gets even a little bit more emotional. About 2 years later, there was a Cub Scout group coming through here, and a grandfather, probably a grandfather, he was old enough to be the grandfather, was waiting in the lobby. And we had that radio sitting there with the story. And he spent, 15 minutes over there just kind of looking at it. And I walked over to him and said, "That's a cool story." He said, he looked at me, he said, "Yeah, I'm from Vietnam. My father had a radio like that. And you know, if they caught him listening to it, they would have killed him." Mm. So those are the stories that are emblematic of the impact that the Voice of America had on the world. Interestingly enough, while the Voice of America broadcasting out of Bethany Station began in the Second World War, the greatest impact was really in the Cold War. And a lot of these folks. We have this one delightful gentleman, his name is Igor. I couldn't write this if I tried. Mm-hmm. He's from Russia, and he lives in the area. And we have him on tape, and he's kind of a big, burly guy. You know, yeah, Radio Moscow, yeah, crops always good. Airplanes never crashed. Yeah. So he said, I listened to the Voice of America and came to the United States. So the impact is truly amazing. Truly amazing.
Well, the thing when I heard you discuss that very story about the travelers,
Felix and Lola,
the travelers coming here with tears in their eyes, and here we drive by every day, and we barely appreciate. Well, we don't appreciate. We barely recognize the location, and so that was one of the reasons that I wanted our viewers to really have an opportunity to get to know you and get to know the Voice of America Museum. Now, they may very well have known you through your former position with WCET. Mention that a little bit.
I spent a few days there.
A few days?
37 years.
Did you really?
Yeah, I worked there for a long time, and I retired. One thing we should talk about, though, we talked about programming, but the one other thing about this place is quite interesting. When they were commissioned to build these transmitters, they were never built. Transmitters this size were never built before. They were literally building it as the proverbial flying the plane as they build it. Mm. And every piece of equipment in the early days, not what you're seeing now, but in the 1940s, was built here in Cincinnati, either in this building or at a candy factory building across the street from which is now the School for the Creative and Performing Arts.
Really?
There was a candy factory that was empty, and Crosley took it over. So there were people literally with their soldering irons and their wires and their sockets and their tubes creating from scratch. Remember, there's no Radio Shack to go to, okay? Oh, I need a diode. Well, what's a diode? The only thing that was not manufactured here are the tubes, the glass tubes, which were commissioned from a company. And so what I'm getting at is the level of technology development Now we have to remember now, this is for the time. We're early 40s, okay? Was as sophisticated for its time as anything going on in Silicon Valley today. And we have another display in the other room. Perhaps we'll get some B-roll of it. All of those antennas, all of the design and the mathematics that goes into creating these is very, very significant. And they were all computed by one man with a piece of paper, a pencil, and a slide rule, which we know what a slide rule is. Most people don't. But to be able to do that at that time, and many, by the way, up until the 90s, the design of those antennas was a state secret. So if you are a political junkie, you'll find lots of things here that you will enjoy learning about. If you're a technical junkie, we can geek you out.
Well, I know people in both camps, and some of us just like to observe others that are really in those camps. I was especially intrigued with all the products that will be seen in another part of the museum that Powell Crosley created. I mean, talk about inventions, talk about entrepreneurship, talk about just a genius.
Crosley, in my mind, and his brother Lewis, Powell Crosley and Lewis, you need to put them together, and I'll tell you why. Crosley was a cross between Edison and P.T. Barnum. And the reason I say that is if you look, first of all, you're correct. He got into radio quite late in his career. He started off in making automobile accessories, and his real claim to fame was a liner for car tires that ameliorated the number of punctures. Apparently, I wasn't around then, but apparently when you went for a drive in the 20s and 30s, you knew you were going to get a flat tire. He created a liner that made that a little bit better and sold thousands of them. So yes, he made tires, he made auto accessories, he built cars. He built airplanes. Most people don't know he had 2 lines of airplanes. He owned the original airline, one of the original airlines, Crosley Airlines, that eventually came together and became American Airlines.
Really?
He had an airport, the transmission plant over in off of Mosteller Road. The Ford transmission plant, that was Crosley's airport. His refrigerators, he was the first person to put shelves in a refrigerator door, the shelvador. And the one that I love to show people here is, and you got to think about this, 1939, he had a device that connected to your radio when WLW at night was, and the device created for you overnight a printed newspaper. It was the first electronic radio transmission of a facsimile. So you went to bed at night, turned on your radio, connected this printer, and when you woke up the next morning, you had a newspaper in 1939. So next time your teenager says, well, I read everything on my iPad, you say, 1939.
Right.
They printed it out for me.
Right.
So anyway, you're correct. The thing that is really phenomenal about it, if you're in the business field and management, Crosley probably today would be diagnosed as ADHD because he got bored. I made that, go on to this. I made that, go on to this. I made that, go on to this. His brother, Lewis, just the opposite. Meticulous, organized, calm. And he would kind of walk after Crosley and figure out how are we going to make money on this.
The compliment.
So
the perfect
together,
compliment. Okay.
they were just a dynamite organization. Individually, Crosley probably, I shouldn't say this, but probably would have ended up being that guy down the street in the garage, and kids don't get too close to that guy, you know. But because he had his brother together, the sum of the parts was very great.
Well, talking about that particular part of the museum leads me to thinking about another very popular part of the museum for me, and that was the entertainment.
Sure.
The entertainment part of this museum.
There's two things. Part of that is related to Crosley, part of it isn't. We all heard about Crosley, the 7,000 or 500,000 watt WLW. That's cool. All right, real cool. All right. Why did he do that? Smart guy. Two things. Radios, when that radio station went on the air, cost about $100. That was a lot of money. Crosley figured out that he could make a radio for less than 10. But the way he did that is by not making it very sensitive, which means you needed to have a high-power transmitter. But if you had one high-power transmitter and you could sell thousands of inexpensive radios, you do two things. Number one, you create your audience. Number two, all the other transmitters at the time were low power. So these radios couldn't get that station. And number three, brilliant, people don't buy radios. People buy entertainment.
Yes.
You know the old Black & Decker, we don't sell drills, we sell holes? Crosley understood that. So he invested heavily, and if you come to the museum, we have a whole wall of people who began their career at WLW. You know, Rod Serling, Red Skelton, Red Barber. I could go on and on and on. All started here. And he paid them quite well because he knew that people do not buy radios, they buy entertainment. Now, that whole wing that you're talking about is the history of broadcasting, especially here in Cincinnati, whether it's Ruth Lyons or Paul Dixon or Jim Scott or Jim LaBarbera or on and on and on. And it's for people who from Cincinnati, that wing, you know, people really do like that. And by the way, that's a wing that we are currently upgrading. So.
Well, I was especially drawn to that wing because one set of my grandparents lived in Springfield. And when we'd visit Springfield, we would turn on the TV and watch Midwestern Hayride.
Midwestern Hayride.
And Ruth Lyons, of course. And Paul Baby.
Paul Baby.
And all the rest.
Right.
And so I just remember growing up, you know, growing up with those entertainment characters.
And a lot of people do.
Personalities.
Yeah, there are so many facets of the museum that people, I think, will find interesting, whether it's the history of broadcasting in Cincinnati. Obviously, the Voice of America is the main story. Right. We also have a collection of radios going back almost to Marconi. And you can actually, by the way, walk through one of the transmitters. People say, well, how big were they? Well, about the size of 3 city buses. They were pretty large.
Well, something else that, well, the whole museum catches my eye.
Good.
But I always think in my mind of the map that's back on the wall, and you have Cincinnati, or you have this station, Bethany Station, which is now, well, at that time it would have been in the country, wouldn't it? You said Cincinnati, but it would have been in the country.
Clyde Hanley, who's an engineer who just passed away in his 90s, well, 3 years ago, but helped us because he helped build the building. And he said when this building was built, Tylersville Road was a single-lane gravel road. So, yes, this was the country. And that's, by the way, why the reason it's here is simple. They had the land, A, and B, remember, Crosley was next door.
Yes.
He already had his facility down the street, so it just was logical. You're going to have the same engineers, you know, on and on. Crosley ran this place with Crosley employees through the 60s. They didn't become federal employees until the 60s. Now, he did it under contract, and he did it more so for the publicity. He charged the federal government $1 over expense a year.
Well, the map I mentioned, you have this location, and then you have strings.
Right, all the relay stations.
All this throughout the world. How many? How many?
Well, at the time, the map depicts what was then. Okay. When we were in operation. Okay. Today, it's much greater. Okay. But Bethany Station transmitted both to people's radios as well as what we would call repeater stations, and that's what the map shows. And I believe there's about 20 locations around the world. Bethany Station handled Europe, primarily Europe, North and South Africa, and South America. There was a similar facility in California that handled the Pacific Rim that was built later on. Okay. But I thought you were going to refer to the antenna map. That's where you have to compute all of the mathematics, you know, the ionosphere, the direction, all of those things. And I always like that because that map, and Cincinnatians, I'm going to say Cincinnatians in general, love that map. And you know why they like that map?
Why?
Because the center of the world is Cincinnati.
Oh, that is the one. I didn't. You said the Cincinnati center of the world.
It's the center of the world. So,
right.
So our dyed in the wool Cincinnatians just love the fact that they're in the middle of the world.
Right.
Everything radiates from Cincinnati.
Well, tell it for our viewers now that they're super interested and know that they need to visit. That's right. What are the hours?
We're open currently? Right now. We're only open on weekends from 1 until 4 every Saturday and Sunday. Admission is $10. Now, many times people have groups, civic groups, church groups, educational groups, and we can then handle a tour anytime during the week, on the evenings, etc. Okay. There's a minimum charge for those, but it's not excessive. But hopefully, when we finish our construction, which we're involved in right now, next summer, I hope we'll be open a couple days. Beginning next summer, we'll be open a couple days during the week. Again, this is primarily a volunteer operation, and we have some wonderful volunteer docents who who can really help you understand what you're watching and seeing. But you know, when you're a total volunteer operation, it's tough to add hours.
Well, you talk about your potential visitors. The VOA Sports Complex right next door. Mention a little bit about.
Well, the Voice of America property that we control is a wedge of the former property. 90% of that property that wasn't sold off for the shopping center and all of that stuff is now a Metro Park. And the Metro Park is essentially an athletic complex of, I think they have over 20 soccer fields. So on a given weekend, there could be 10,000 people next door. One of the things we just completed last year was now, between games, if you want, there is a walkway between their facility and our facility. And if you've ever been to soccer games, you know that soccer tournaments, you sometimes have two or 3 hours, and you don't want to move that car because you'll never get a parking space again. So, yeah, the one thing, and I have to be perfectly clear on this, and it's somewhat of a negative, but I want to be clear. There is not a lot here for young kids. And when I'd say young kids, I would say 6th grade and under, unless they're very precocious, will not find anything here. But teenagers that are interested in history and above will. And that's one of the reasons we no longer charge for children. Okay. Children are free to 16 years old. 16 and above is an adult. And we did that because quite frankly, it's pretty difficult to explain to a third grader the Cold War or Nazi Germany or propaganda, et cetera. So we decided, you know, we're just
Although I do have to say I have a 6- and 7-year-old granddaughter, grandson, and they teach me things about my iPhone that I didn't know.
Well,
and so
that's true.
They might enjoy seeing
The technical side,
how
perhaps.
it started and how it evolved, that kind of thing.
It could,
right.
but
that's good to know,
yeah.
though. That's good to know.
All right.
Very good. Well, we have only explored the tip of the iceberg today, but I hope that it encourages you to venture out to the museum here on Tylersville Road in Westchester. Easy to get to. Tylersville Road exit off of 75. Or if you're on the other side, if you're on 71.
Come down 42, make a right.
That's right, that's right. And we just hope that you take the time to make those adventures on the roads less traveled. That's what I love to call these, because there is so much history to be found, even right here in our own Southwest Ohio, and more specifically right here in Westchester. So my thanks to you, Jack Dominic, for just all the information that you share with us.
My pleasure.
And I'm looking forward to the cameras traveling through the museum after we finish our interview,
sure,
so they can take some clips and show you some of the areas of the museum that we've mentioned today. So on that note, we hope that you're feeling good, and we'll see you soon. Bye for now.